There are some things you say that you can't take back. Not because the words were cruel, but because they were true, and the truth changed everything, before you even had a chance to understand what you'd admitted. I was 26 years old, standing in my best friend's kitchen on a Wednesday night in October, eating leftover butter chicken straight from the container, when I said the thing that split my life into before and after. I wasn't trying to be funny. I wasn't trying to be anything. I was just tired and a little careless and maybe, somewhere underneath it all, more honest than I'd allowed myself to be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before any of that happened, you need to understand what life looked like back then. I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, the kind of city that feels small enough to know everyone but big enough that you can still disappear when you need to. My name is Adam, and for most of my mid-20s, I was the kind of guy who had his life technically together but emotionally scattered. I had a decent job in logistics at a distribution company just outside the city, a one-bedroom apartment with a second-hand couch I was actually proud of, and a best friend named Scott, whose kitchen I treated like my own. Scott Beaumont and I had been close since we were 13. We played on the same rep hockey team, survived the same terrible high school, and somehow ended up living in the same city as adults without ever really planning it that way. After his dad left when we were in our late teens, Scott moved in with his mom, and even after he got older, he stayed. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he and his mother had that kind of relationship. Honest, easy. No performance required. His mom's name was Nora Beaumont. I need to be careful about how I describe Nora, because whatever I say is going to sound like something it isn't. And for a long time, that was exactly the problem. She was 48 when all of this started. She worked as a physiotherapist at a sports medicine clinic in town, the kind of work that requires a particular kind of patience and precision. She was tall, the kind of tall that you notice when she walks into a room, and she had this way of listening when you spoke that made you feel like the most interesting person in the conversation. Not in a flattering way, in a real way. Like she was actually thinking about what you were saying. To me, for most of the years I knew her, she was just Scott's mom. She made good coffee, asked real questions, and occasionally told us we were both idiots when we deserved it. That was the whole of it, as far as I was concerned, until it wasn't. Scott and I had been arguing the whole drive back from the gym that evening, the way we always argued, about hockey, about some trade the Leafs had made, about absolutely nothing. We were annoying and loud and comfortable in the way that only old friends can be. We grabbed food on the way home and ended up in his kitchen, the kind of relaxed Wednesday night that doesn't announce itself as anything important. Nora had gotten home from work maybe 20 minutes before us. She was still in her clinic clothes, dark slacks, a soft gray sweater, her hair slightly loose from whatever she'd had it in for work. She was leaning against the counter with a cup of tea, asking Scott about something to do with his car insurance. And I was standing across from her eating directly from the container because Scott never had enough bowls clean. I don't remember exactly what triggered it. Scott had said something teasing about his mom still looking like she could card someone at the door, and I laughed, and without thinking, without filtering anything at all, I said it. I said that Nora was honestly better looking than most of the women I'd gone out with in the past 2 years. The room went very quiet. Scott stared at me the way you stare at someone who has just knocked over an entire display rack in a store. That particular brand of horrified disbelief. I heard the words hanging in the air between all three of us and felt my stomach drop clean through the floor. I started laughing immediately, that reflex laugh that means nothing, except please don't make this what it is. I said something like, okay, that came out wrong. Sorry, Nora. Forget I said anything. And then I looked at her. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't offended. She was looking at me with this expression I couldn't place, something quiet and a little amused. And then she tilted her head slightly and said, very calmly, that she appreciated the honesty. Scott made a noise that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan and said, okay, we're changing the subject right now. And we did, technically. But the air in the room had shifted in a way that doesn't shift back, and all three of us knew it. I left about an hour later. Scott walked me to the door and said quietly, so his mom wouldn't hear, that I was not allowed to make it weird. I told him I wouldn't. I meant it. But something had happened, and I couldn't explain what. For the next couple of weeks, I gave Scott's house a wider berth than usual, but I suggested the gym, or my place, or the bar on Stone Road we'd been going to since we were old enough. I told myself I was being considerate, Really, I was avoiding something I didn't have a name for yet. Then, about 3 weeks after that night, I had to drop something off at Scott's place. A set of hockey gloves he'd left in my car. He wasn't home. Nora answered the door. She invited me in for coffee while I waited to see if Scott would turn up. I almost said no. I don't know why I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where none of this had started. And at first it was easy. She asked about work. I asked about the clinic. She mentioned a patient she was treating, a junior hockey player rehabbing his shoulder. And I ended up talking for 20 minutes about my own shoulder surgery at 19. The conversation found its own current, and then she said, out of nowhere, that she'd thought about what I said. I set down my mug. I told her I hadn't meant anything by it. She smiled, but it was a careful smile. She said she knew that, but she'd been thinking about something it made her realize, which was that she'd spent so long being somebody's mom and somebody's colleague and somebody's responsible neighbor that she'd genuinely forgotten what it felt like for someone to just see her. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said she wasn't telling me that to make me uncomfortable. She just thought it was worth saying out loud, because she didn't get a lot of chances to say true things to someone who wasn't going to immediately reassure her or change the subject. I told her that sounded lonely. She said it was. Sometimes Scott never showed up. I left after an hour, and the whole drive home I sat with this feeling in my chest that I didn't want to examine too closely. It felt like standing at the edge of something, not falling. Just standing there knowing the edge was there. Over the next month, it happened again a few more times. Not planned. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I'd stop by for something and Scott would be out, and Nora would be home, and we'd end up talking. About her work, about my family, about what we both thought we'd be doing by now versus what we were actually doing. She had this directness that I wasn't used to. She didn't hedge. She said what she meant, and she expected you to do the same. And there was something almost disorienting about it because I realized how rarely anyone actually talked to me that way. One evening she mentioned that she'd put off a lot of things in her 40s. Her own fitness, a photography class she'd been meaning to take, the kind of quiet hobbies you give up when you're raising someone and working full-time and holding the whole thing together. She said it without any bitterness. Just as fact, but I found myself thinking about it for days afterward. I knew I was in trouble when I started editing what I told Scott. He and I talked about everything. That was the whole foundation. He was the person I called when something went wrong, the person I vented to, the person who told me the truth when I was being an idiot. And I was starting to have this entire interior experience that I was deliberately hiding from him. That felt worse than anything else. Not the feeling itself, but the hiding. I finally told him on a Saturday afternoon in November. We were at the rink just skating after the open session, the way we'd done since we were kids. No one else around. I stopped by the boards and told him I needed to say something that was going to sound wrong no matter how I said it. He didn't say anything. He just waited. I told him that I thought I had feelings for his mom, not as a joke, not as some stupid offhand comment, as a real thing that I'd been trying to talk myself out of for weeks and couldn't. I watched his face go through 3 or 4 things very fast. He pushed off from the boards and skated a slow loop around the rink. I stood there. He came back. He said that was the last thing he'd expected me to say. I told him I understood if he needed me to leave, if he needed to not talk to me for a while, if this ended things. I said I wasn't trying to put him in the middle of anything, and I would completely back off, and whatever he needed was what I was going to do. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said that his mom had been alone for a long time, and that she never complained about it, and that somehow that was worse. I didn't know what to do with that. He said he needed time. I gave him time, more time than I expected. There were 6 weeks where Scott and I didn't talk, not properly, not the way we usually did. We sent a few text surface-level stuff, but the real thread between us had gone quiet. Those were some of the harder weeks I can remember. Not dramatic, just hollow. Like a room with the furniture moved and you keep reaching for things in the wrong places. During that time, I wasn't seeing Nora either. I'd made that decision on my own without being asked. It felt like the right thing. It would have been too easy to use her as a way to avoid sitting with what I'd disrupted, and I wasn't willing to do that. I spent a lot of evenings that winter driving around. Guelph in November is not a scenic place to process your feelings, but I did a lot of it anyway. I thought about loyalty and what it actually means. I thought about the fact that caring about someone and acting on it are 2 entirely different things, and whether the difference matters if the caring itself has already changed everything. I thought about what Nora had said that evening at the kitchen table about being seen. I called my sister during that period, my older sister Claudia, who has always been better at this kind of thing than I am. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, which is not her usual style, so I knew she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that the most interesting part of the story to her was how I talked about Nora as a person, not just as the woman the situation was about. She said that actually matters. I hadn't thought about it that way. Late in December, Scott texted me and asked if I wanted to grab food. That was it, no explanation, no big preface. Just food, a specific place, a specific time. I showed up. He was already there. We ate for a while without saying anything about it. And then, eventually, he put down his fork and said that he'd had a conversation with his mom. She hadn't told him what to think. She'd just told him that she was tired of making decisions based on what was easier for everyone else, and that she'd spent enough of her life doing that. He said he'd watched her, in the weeks after I came to him, and she wasn't doing any differently than she always did. She got up and went to work and came home and made dinner and was fine. But the fineness was what got to him. She'd fine for so long. He'd never actually thought about what that was costing her. He said, very quietly, that he wasn't going to tell me it was okay because it wasn't his thing to okay, but he also wasn't going to stand in the way of something just because it made him uncomfortable. Then he said, if you hurt her, I will not forgive you. Not in a movie way, just as a fact. I told him I understood. We finished dinner. We talked about the Leafs. It wasn't easy, but it was real, which has always been the better version of things. Nora and I had our first actual date in late January. We drove out to a restaurant in Elora. Her suggestion, she'd been meaning to try it for years, and sat by the window looking out at the gorge in the snow, and I was more nervous than I'd been since I was a teenager. She was not. She was exactly herself, direct and warm and funny in a dry, unhurried way, and halfway through the main course I thought, this is what I was trying to get at. This is the thing I was reaching toward without knowing it. We talked for almost 4 hours. She told me about her own 20s, about the years before Scott, about the version of herself she'd set aside to do the work of raising someone well. She didn't have regrets about it, not the deep kind, but she did have this feeling, she said, that there might be time left to do things differently, if she was brave enough to not default to what was safe. I told her that I thought she was probably the bravest person I knew, just not in the way anyone would notice from the outside. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said she hoped I knew what I was getting into. I said I was beginning to. The next year was not simple. I want to be honest about that, because the story is not actually about a joke and a beginning. It's about the long middle part, which is where everything real happens. There were dinners at Scott's house that were stiff and careful at first. There were moments when the three of us would be in the same room, and someone would say something, and there would be this half-second of recalibration. While everyone figured out how to hold the new shape of things, Scott had moments where he was genuinely generous about it, and moments where he went quiet in a way that I understood and didn't take personally. Nora and I learned each other slowly, the way adults do, without the rush of being young. She was patient with my tendency to understate things. I got better at asking instead of assuming. We drove up to Tobermory one weekend that summer, just the two of us, and walked along the cliffs at the national park. And I think somewhere in the middle of that afternoon I stopped waiting for it to feel strange and just let it feel like what it was. About 8 months in, Scott and I had a real conversation about it. Not about permission, past that, but about what it actually meant for the three of us going forward. He said something that surprised me. He said the hardest part wasn't the situation itself. It was realizing that his mom had been lonely for a long time, and he'd been close enough to see it, and had somehow just accepted it as a fixed part of reality. He said he didn't know how to sit with that. I told him that she hadn't been waiting to be rescued. That wasn't the shape of it at all. He said he knew. That was somehow the point. It's been 3 years now. Scott and I are still what we've always been, which is not something I'm sentimental about because it's just true. Some things you almost lose and then you don't, and you're left with a more honest version of what was there before. Nora and I aren't in a hurry about anything. We have what we have, and it's real. Which is the whole thing, really. She signed up for that photography class. She's actually good at it, annoyingly so. With this eye for light that makes you realize she's been paying attention to things all along. Sometimes the three of us sit in that kitchen on a Wednesday evening, drinking bad coffee and arguing about hockey. And Scott will mention something from a couple of years ago and look at me with this expression that's too complicated to describe. Not quite amusement. Not quite acceptance. Something more honest than both. And once, just once, he said, almost to himself, that at least I had decent taste. That's as close as we've ever come to talking about where it started. The night I said something careless and true. Standing in a kitchen I'd stood in hundreds of times before, not knowing that one thoughtless sentence could be the thing that finally told me what I'd been paying attention to all along. I didn't plan any of it. I wouldn't recommend any of it. But if you've ever had a moment where life came off the rails in a direction you didn't see coming, where something unexpected turned out to be the truest thing that ever happened to you, then you already know the part of this story I can't quite put into words. Write it in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one.